Charles Kesler is the Dengler-Dykma Distinguished Professor of Government at Claremont McKenna College. He served as director of the Claremont College's Henry Salvatore Center for the Study of Individual Freedom in the Modern World from 1989 to 2008. He is editor of the well-known Claremont Review of Books and a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute for the Study of Statesmanship and Political Philosophy. His edition of the Federalist Papers, which I know well as a politics student, was published by Signet Classic by Penguin Putman and is the best-selling edition in the country. He is the editor of and a contributor to Saving the Revolution, the Federalist Papers and the American Founding, and has written extensively on American constitutionalism and American political thought. He is co-editor with the late William F. Buckley, Jr. of Keeping the Tablets, Modern American Conservative Thought. His articles on contemporary politics have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, Policy Review, National Review, the Weekly Standard, and other journals. He is the author most recently of an excellent book, which might be the best book on our current president, Barack Obama, and the fourth wave of liberalism. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Kesler.
Thank you very much, Penelope. It's always a great pleasure and a privilege to be here speaking for Hillsdale and before such a distinguished group of men and women. Am I leaving anyone out? And I'm delighted also to be here to help to celebrate the continued prosperity of the Kirby Center here in Washington, D.C. It's a fitting extension, it seems to me, of Hillsdale's efforts under President Arnn to teach the U.S. Constitution and to focus attention on and off the campus on the question of what has happened to our Constitution in the last 100 years in particular, as the notion of what the progressives call the living Constitution has come to eclipse the actual written Constitution. It's true that Larry and I go back a long way. He is, of course, much older than I am. But I was very young when I began, when I arrived in Claremont. Penny looks completely unchanged, though, perhaps more beautiful than ever. And Larry looks very much like himself, I think. But it's always good to be with them and to have a chance to talk about old times and new times. Well, the occasion of our meeting today is Constitution Day, which for you sticklers was Monday, September 17th, celebrating the day that the Constitution was reported out of the Constitutional Convention. But for liberals, every day is Constitution Day, living Constitution Day, especially if the Supreme Court is in session. By the way, I asked for an empty chair to be placed up here. What happened? What happened to my prop? I didn't prepare any remarks, but I thought, no. Well, the title of my book that addresses these subjects is I Am the Change, Barack Obama and the Crisis of Liberalism. And obviously the title is an attempt at a play on words with designed to bring out Barack Obama's Louis XIV side. L'état c'est moi, I am the state. I think Obama is I am the change, you know. And he actually came very close to saying something precisely like that, and close enough, you know, to be exploited. There were other titles that we considered for this book, but we decided against them. One of my favorites was suggested by my friend Bill Vogeley, Barack Obama, what the hell were we thinking? And then more recently, though, I came up with this idea, which for some reason the publisher rejected, 50 Shades of Barack Obama. I don't know. I think that would have sold. I'm not sure. But as against many of my friends in the conservative movement, I don't think it's that helpful to try to understand Obama differently initially than he understands himself. I think it's both fair and necessary that we try to meet him on his own ground. And what I tried to do in this book is, by reading his speeches, his interviews, his books, and those of many liberals before him, to put him in the context of American liberalism. One could call him a socialist, and many writers on the conservative side do. But it's hard. He doesn't call himself a socialist, and it's hard to call him. If you call him a socialist for wanting to raise the upper tax bracket to 39% and change, what would you call FDR, who raised it to 79%, and who put inheritance taxes at 70% at the top marginal rate? If Barack Obama is a socialist in that sense, then many leading liberals of the past century would be even more socialistic than he. Nor do I think, of course, that one gets very far in trying to understand him as a foreigner or as a closet Muslim or anything like that. And I even disagree with my old friend Dinesh D'Souza, who tries to understand him as a third world ideologue, as a kind of anti-colonialist who inherited these strange ideas from his Kenyan father. The problem with that, I think, is that it suggests that there's something uniquely bad about Obama, that if he hadn't had a Kenyan father, he'd be perfectly okay. If he hadn't encountered anti-colonialism, he would be okay. But in fact, anti-colonialism, I don't think, explains national health care, the stimulus bill, Dodd-Frank, all of the signature achievements of his administration, on which he was backed by every liberal Democrat in the Congress, none of whom had Kenyan fathers. So it seems to me one has to begin by understanding Obama as he understands himself, as a liberal, as a progressive. And that's what I try to do. But it's harder to understand what it means to be a liberal anymore. And so what I do in my book is to put between two covers the story of modern liberalism, from Woodrow Wilson to the present, and to try to tell Obama's place in that story and his significance in that story, which is, I think, very large. For many decades, the American Republic didn't know what had hit it after liberalism began to spread in our politics about 100 years ago. Conservatives in particular have had a very hard time of understanding their opponent, of trying to figure out who or what it was that conservatives are opposing. I'll just mention some of the different ways that conservatives have understood the left in America, or liberalism in America. One in particular, Richard Weaver, used to argue that liberalism came out of a form of medieval nominalism, out of something 900 years ago. Russell Kirk and others argue that our liberalism is a continuation of the French Revolution, something from several centuries ago as well. A few conservatives have maintained that liberalism originates in the regimenting spirit of industrialization, and that we'd all be better off becoming agrarians again. More conservatives and more even well-known conservatives have argued that Abraham Lincoln was the first liberal, and that he and the anti-slavery cause, their universalism, somehow gave birth to the modern state. And of course, there have been a few stout conservatives over the years who have argued that liberalism is the work of Satan. This is the church lady school. But it's also something that, Whittaker Chambers really is a big theme of Whittaker Chambers' book, that liberalism emerges from the desire to want to replace God in our life. And there's some truth to that, and there's some truth to at least a couple of these explanations, but obviously I would say none of them is adequate. But our trouble, conservatives' trouble with identifying our opponent, is echoed on the left because liberals also have trouble explaining their movement and explaining their purposes. If you read books by liberals about liberalism, of which, let me tell you, there are quite a few, you'll find that the most popular explanation of liberalism today by liberals is that it's nothing but the spirit of bold, persistent experimentation. This is a phrase from FDR. President Obama quoted it just a few weeks ago in his second acceptance speech, that is his acceptance speech of this year. Bold, persistent experimentation. In other words, liberalism is nothing but pragmatism, the desire to find out what works in order to cure our social problems. Liberalism is completely, if you believe them, unideological, even untheoretical. In fact, it's downright conservative, because all it's trying to do is adjust our political arrangements to keep them in sync with our economic and social progress. If you listen to liberals, it's conservatives who are the ideologues. They have theories like trickle-down economics or originalism, when it comes to how to interpret the Constitution. Now, the liberals' modest account of themselves is, of course, self-interested. It's designed to insulate them from charges of radicalism that would emerge if they actually began to talk about their own doctrines. They use evolution to disguise revolution. The account they give themselves is like the policeman who says, "Keep moving. There's nothing to see here. Keep moving." Don't look at the thing you want to look at, and which is so obvious. And so their favorite account of themselves under this nostrum of the living Constitution, they present as merely a modest, adaptive, evolutionary change designed to keep the Constitution alive and relevant, because the alternative to their living Constitution is a dead Constitution. That's their argument. A Constitution that belongs to a world, the 18th century, that is dead and gone, to use Justice Brennan's famous phrase. If you want to have a dead Constitution, like the conservatives argue, you can. But if you want to have a living Constitution, then you have to follow the liberal mode of interpreting it. But this false modesty doesn't hide the fact that liberals also speak of their vision, their values, and most revealingly of the transformation that they seek in American politics. One of Barack Obama's few memorable lines was just before the election, when he said, "We're 5 days away from fundamentally transforming the United States of America." He didn't say into what. Liberals never do. They keep a studied ambiguity about what they want us to become, but they sure don't want us to stay what we are or return to what we were. That much is clear. Now, as a political phenomenon, American liberalism, it seems to me, is best understood by following the history of the United States and the history of our political contests. As a political phenomenon, it's exactly 100 years old. It emerged in the progressive movement that broke into our politics in the 1912 election, the election won by Woodrow Wilson. It propagated itself in our politics in 3 waves. the New Freedom, associated with Wilson, of course, the New Deal, and then the Great Society, along with its tragic chorus, the New Left. Now, each of these waves set out to transform America, as the name suggested. If you want to make a great society, the implication is the existing society is a lousy one. A New Deal implies that the old deal is obsolete or unfair. And the New Freedom, not the new birth of freedom that Abraham Lincoln talked about, but the new freedom means the old is obsolete. You must start again, somehow, in our politics. That means that Obama's apparent fourth wave of liberal activism is only the latest installment of this fundamental desire, this drive to fundamentally change our politics. Now, it ought to encourage us that each one of these prior waves of liberalism was stopped in its tracks eventually. You know, by 1920, progressivism was over. It was a spent force. By 1936, or at the latest 1938, the New Deal was finished as an active reform movement. Dr. Win the War had replaced Dr. New Deal, as FDR liked to put it. And of course, in the 1960s, the Great Society, which didn't begin till late 1963, when Lyndon Johnson succeeded the slain President Kennedy, was effectively over by about 1966 or 67. So each wave only lasted a few years. They can be stopped, but we should be chastened by the knowledge that this transformative process started again a generation later in every case. Liberalism apparently can be stopped, but not for long. In 2010, the voters stopped Barack Obama's transformation. I mean, he's really got nothing much done since 2010. But he succeeded in pushing through, in the first 2 years that he was in office, a great deal. We don't know whether he's now stopped and liberalism is in stasis mode again. That will be determined in large part by the election coming up. But all told, if you look at now the last 100 years, the 20th century was very much what my late friend Tom Silver liked to call the liberal century. Remember that conservatism didn't arrive on the scene of our politics until late in that century. Its major victories were very late. Ronald Reagan in 1980, Newt Gingrich taking the House in 1994. I mean, the century was 4/5 over before conservatism really began to assert itself in politics. Conservatism didn't even appear until the first two waves of liberalism had done their work. Conservatism starts in the 1950s, one could say, the mid-1950s. National Review was founded in 1955. So liberals had already transformed America and American politics to some extent before conservatism even got into the game, before it began to be opposed. Now, all of the alluvial silt from the stream of liberalism over the past century deposited itself in Barack Obama's formation. The crisis of liberalism is Obama's crisis. And so rather than, as I actually do in my book, explaining and criticizing each stage of liberalism, I thought it better just to concentrate on Obama's, or mainly concentrate on Obama's own appropriation of them. And there's certainly, from his point of view, plenty to be said about what liberalism means and what it aims at. To begin with, he calls himself a progressive. He said so in the 2008 campaign, as did Hillary Clinton. Both of them were running away from the liberal label, switching back to the original label of progressive. What do progressives believe in 1912 or in 2012? Well, if you believe Woodrow Wilson, and you can always read R.J. Pestrito's excellent book on Woodrow Wilson as a guide, progressives literally believe in the inevitability of human progress. And by literally, I mean literally. As opposed to what most speakers mean when they say literally, figuratively. No, they literally believed in the inevitability of human progress, and that, and this is very important, that moral and political progress went hand in hand with technological and scientific progress. I mean, we all sort of believe in infinite scientific progress. That's possible. You never know everything. But the notion that human beings and their politics are perfectible is a very different contention. I think most sensible people, including the founders, thought that those two things did not advance in perfect harmony, could not advance in perfect harmony, because man's nature is not, in fact, perfectible. I mean, we can make progress towards its perfection, but we never can arrive at human perfection. You can't ever expect, as Hamilton said, perfect work from the hands of imperfect man. And I think that's a very conservative way of looking at human nature. But liberals think that human progress is inevitable because of a new doctrine or discovery concerning history, that history has a mind of its own, and it has a destination in that mind, and that all events cooperate toward realizing that destiny. As R.J. could explain, Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel, was the greatest proponent of this view of philosophy of history in the 19th century. And I could say, fortunately, that American liberalism has more of Hegel in it than of his disciple and critic Karl Marx. And we're very lucky that American liberalism is evolutionary and not revolutionary, because those were two streams from a common source. But let me offer two quotations, one old and one new, that I think help to characterize this attitude of progressivism. When he was the president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson said something to students that he repeated when he was running for the presidency in 1912, and he put it between the covers of his book, The New Freedom, the collected speeches or edited speeches of that year. And as president of the university, he is, strictly speaking, comparable to Larry Arnn. And so, one could not imagine Larry Arnn saying this, but the fact that Woodrow Wilson proclaimed it, repeated it in politics, highlighted it, in a way tells you all you need to know about the difference between liberalism and conservatism. What Wilson said was, his objective at Princeton, the objective of college education, ought to be to make the sons as much unlike their fathers as possible. Now just think about that, to make the sons as unlike their fathers as possible. Not because the fathers weren't splendid fellows, and not, to be sure, because Wilson was averse to cashing their sons' tuition checks, but because the fathers necessarily belonged to a world that was dying, and the sons belonged to a better world, a new world that was dawning. If you take that as your educational goal, then it implies a complete reorientation of moral and political studies, from devotion to what had been thought and said and done in the best instances in the past, to the drama of a better, essentially unprecedented world to come. That's why liberals have never been so interested in history. History describes human nature as we knew it, not human nature as it will be in the future. And so it's no guide for us now to look back and see the failures or even the successes of the past. The only way to properly study the past from a progressive point of view was an anticipation of something much grander to come. Compared to the future, Wilson said, the present is as nothing. The past, he implied, was less than nothing. It's okay, one could say, to study Abraham Lincoln, so long as you treat him as Barack Obama's prefiguration. That's in effect what that means. Now, the American founders, by contrast, viewed the great figures of the past more or less as contemporaries, because they didn't think that human nature changed. At their best, the founders tried at least to understand the past as it had understood itself before trying to understand it differently or better. So, many of the founders studied ancient languages, Hebrew, as well as modern languages. And they had a deep acquaintance with those texts. Jefferson's letters, Adams's letters are full of snippets of Greek, ancient Greek and Latin, and occasionally even Hebrew, as well as French, and a little bit of Italian. In other words, these were not parochial men. These were men who had studied the past because they thought they could learn something from it, not just something about it. But our president today, who considers himself, as you know, a citizen of the world, speaks one language, English. That's his cosmopolitanism. But he doesn't feel like he has to confront the past or study the past, because the assumption is of progressivism. We come later, therefore we see better and farther and are wiser than any that came before. When Woodrow Wilson argued against what he called blind worship of the Constitution, what he meant really was we should not have any kind of veneration for so old and obsolete a document. And that generation applied this principle of progress to religion just as ruthlessly as they did to education and to politics. So when Obama says he believes in the living Constitution, as he does in his second book, The Audacity of Hope, he's using a phrase and an idea that is 100 years old, that comes especially from Woodrow Wilson. And the term living Constitution is a very attractive one for the left. It sounds so natural, so green, so organic, just like those highly touted foods in the supermarket that charge extra for the wormholes. But this naturalistic connotation or implication is a deliberate misdirection, because the idea of the living Constitution doesn't stand or fall by natural selection. Its principle is artificial selection. The logic of it is, look, we have evolved to the point where now we understand evolution and we can control it from here on. We can control our own evolution. We can take charge of society's development as well. In other words, the living Constitution is not some laissez-faire slogan, let the Constitution grow as it naturally would. No, it's a mandate for experts, scientists, to take charge of government and to experiment on the formerly sovereign people rather than simply represent them. It's a mandate to build a new state and breed, as it were, a better people. The living Constitution is really constitutional eugenics. So, amid the seeming flux of the living Constitution, which everything, all institutions and practices are up for change, following the Darwinian law of life, as liberals will tell you, it's surprising to find that some things are permanent. And here's my second quotation from President Obama, speaking about his health care bill. Quote, "I am not the first president to take up this cause," he told Congress in September 2009, "but I am determined to be the last." In other words, he considers his law to be progressive and progress to be irreversible. One cannot turn back the clock. Once you have Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, once you have these fundamental new programs to vindicate new social and economic rights, there's no going back. The fact that they may be unconstitutional is no argument against them. because the living Constitution is the real Constitution. To appeal to the written Constitution against something like Obamacare would be, from the liberal point of view, unconstitutional. You can't do that. The living Constitution is more authoritative than the old Constitution because it's designed to replace it. So Obamacare does mark a triumph of liberalism, no doubt about it, I think. Alone, it would qualify Obama's face for the liberal Mount Rushmore. More specifically, Obamacare is, of course, a triumph for entitlement rights, one of the New Deal's lasting contributions to liberalism. And these new kinds of rights imply a whole new view of the social contract. If you look at FDR, look at his Commonwealth Club address in 1932, probably his most theoretical or philosophical speech, he explains what this new contract consists of. There he says that the contract is between the people and their rulers, not among individuals who have pre-existing rights from nature or from God, but a contract between the people and their rulers in which the people give the rulers power in exchange for the rulers giving them rights. In other words, the more powerful you make government, the more rights it can give you. All kinds of welfare rights, regulatory waivers. All of our liberties come from the government choosing not to govern us, not choosing to exempt us from its authority. In other words, the social contract, as the liberals now explain it, is very much more like Magna Carta than it is like the Declaration of Independence. And this leads to what I call the first law of big government. There's no reason to fear government, no matter how big it gets or strong it gets, because the more power it has, the more rights it can grant to us. And the sinister implication, of course, is that if our rights are dependent upon government, why shouldn't we be? But of course, someone has to pay for these rights, these new rights. Free speech doesn't really cost anything, but a right to health care sure does. Every right implies a duty, but welfare state duties are both vague and vaguely assigned. Who pays for the hospital rooms and procedures and the doctor's time that the right to health care requires? Who pays for the job that is guaranteed to every American under the liberal dispensation? And the left has been extremely slippery in answering that question. Sometimes they say, well, of course, everyone pays because it's like social insurance. You pay the premium and then you get the benefit at the end. But of course, it's not a secret that most people receive much more than they contributed to the program. And if a few people do, that's okay, that's called insurance. But if everybody receives more, that can't work as insurance. And so the left soon changes their tune and says, well, it's actually the rich who are going to pay. We're going to tax them at higher rates, spread the wealth around, and the result will be we can fund all of the promises of the welfare state. But that doesn't work either, as we are quickly finding out. And this problem, the problem that the state can manufacture many more promises than it can possibly pay for, is at the root of liberalism's fiscal implosion. We see it beginning in Europe. We see the harbingers of it in our own case. And the cause is, as Mrs. Thatcher pointed out long ago, you quickly run out of other people's money. Finally, President Obama is a child of the 60s, literally. He was born in 1961 to an interracial couple. His father was a Kenyan, a socialist and anti-colonialist, and that much of Dinesh's argument is undeniable. His mother was a dreamy flower child who eventually earned a doctorate in cultural anthropology, probably the most left-wing of all left-wing disciplines in the academy. And her advisor in her PhD program was John Dewey's granddaughter. As they say, you can't make this stuff up. Now, for Obama, the 1960s ran until the 1980s, or until the success of Ronald Reagan became clear. As a young man, Obama suffered a kind of 60s envy. After all, he was too young. He missed out on the civil rights movement and the New Left, but he was determined to experience them vicariously. And as a young man, he sort of replayed the 60s in his own life. He tried drugs, you know, not just marijuana, but cocaine. He rallied against South Africa. He community organized. He gave and delighted in giving political speeches and tried to get in touch with the black experience in America. I mean, he joined Reverend Wright's church for political reasons, but also because he wanted to experience something he hadn't experienced before, the black church. So in general, you could say, as he says, that he was searching for meaning, something that is very much a kind of 60s existential theme. But he also shared the civil rights movement's determination to make history rather than to let it happen, or to trust it to redeem injustice in the long run, in its own good time. And one also detects in Obama stirrings of postmodernism, the notion that universal values, a phrase he does use from time to time, even universal truths he speaks about occasionally, are not universal and probably not true in any objective sense. One can see these ideas at work in Dreams from My Father, the heavily fictionalized autobiography that he wrote. Now, politicians are notoriously untruthful. Let's grant that. But no future president ever boasted that he was making stuff up in order to tell his story better. In other words, in order to tell his story the way he wanted to tell it. But Obama does. He tells you in the beginning of Dreams from My Father that this is not all true, that he's combined characters, that he's invented incidents, that he's rearranged chronology. In other words, it's a very postmodern biography. It's a book about not his real self or his historical self, but his self-created self. It's Obama as he ought to be, or at least as he wants to present himself to us. And this motive covers, of course, covering up several inconvenient truths about his own upbringing. For example, you know, this black communist, Frank Marshall Davis, you've all heard about probably in one way or another, who is referred to in the book simply as Frank and never identified with his actual political vocation. Or the incident that Obama cleverly alludes to in the book, but only Stanley Kurtz tracked down, namely that Obama, when he was a student at Columbia, attended at Cooper Union the Democratic Socialists of America conference celebrating the 100th centenary of the death of Karl Marx. I guess it would have been better if, it would have been worse if it was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx, but still, it's an interesting biographical fact that was unreported until last year. At any rate, we begin to see where Obama goes beyond old-fashioned liberalism, beyond the creed of Woodrow Wilson or Franklin Roosevelt. Obama doubts, or comes close to doubting, the inevitability of progress, partly because he doubts that there are fixed goalposts or standards by which to measure progress. The prophet leader, as it were, the great hero figure of liberal politics, the charismatic leader that liberals all long for, is therefore on his own, if there's no such thing as progress that he can ride along on and foresee. The prophet leader is forced to tell stories about the future that a future he cannot know or discern anymore, but can only, if his will to power is sufficiently strong, will into existence. If history has no happy ending in store, no guaranteed values of its own, then the leader may have no choice but to impose his values on the chaos. Thus, the second half of liberalism's crisis. The first is fiscal, the second philosophical. Avant-garde liberals, especially in the academy, tend no longer to believe liberalism is true or right in any objective sense. Fortunately, our president is not a thoroughgoing postmodernist, but his confusion about whether there is truth, combined with the traditional liberal impatience with the Constitution, makes for a very harrowing combination. And so we ought to remember that not every change is an improvement. A movement that began by promising to every American a new freedom and a new deal beyond necessitousness now runs from the necessity of paying its own bills. A movement that promised complete spiritual fulfillment in a great society, including the right to choose one's own values and lifestyle, now verges on confessing that no lifestyle can be said to be better than any other. And the movement that put such faith in its leaders' ability to understand, predict, and control the future now faces a very uncertain and perilous future, with or without Barack Obama. This is why, of course, the election of 2012 is so important. The constitutionality of the modern state and the grounds of our own equality and liberty are at stake in this election as never before. So on the occasion of Constitution Day, let us rededicate ourselves to the perpetuation of our actual Constitution, the Republic, and its way of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kesler. We now have time for a few questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring the mic to you.
Hi, Ken Masugi here.
Charles, here. Where are you? Oh, over there,
oh.
Sorry.
Hi, very good, Charles.
A voice from beyond.
Yes,
I didn't know.
Voice of God, as they say. What about Obama's record on foreign policy? We think of Wilson and FDR as war presidents, and Obama, of course, taking us out of wars, but continuing or even intensifying Bush's national security policy in many areas. So what do you make of that? Is that cover for a more radical domestic policy, or did he learn something when he came into office and realized these were necessary measures?
Well, that's a good question about his foreign policy. He certainly has political reasons to try to shuck off the bad reputation that liberalism has for conducting weak foreign policy. One of the reasons why he and Hillary both go back to the term progressive is that liberalism is spoiled on foreign policy questions. They're helped, of course, by the fact that communism collapsed, and so the old distinctions don't have the vitality they once did. But when Obama writes about foreign policy, when he speaks about foreign policy, he recurs most often to Roosevelt, to FDR, and to Rooseveltian terms. He speaks about the four freedoms, for example, often when he's talking foreign policy. And I think the decision to have a more muscular foreign policy, as we say today, is in part a principled decision by him and in part a political one. I think on the principled side, he wants to reconnect himself and his administration to the Roosevelt legacy of fighting tyrants, or at least killing tyrants, But he doesn't want to make that into a hard and fast principle, because to do so, I think he thinks would incline him much too much to puff up the United States and its own role in the world. What separates him most obviously from FDR is Obama's deep suspicions that we can actually be a force for good in the world. And so he recurs to something like the limited or a modified form of FDR's realism in the interest of a much more constrained form of idealism. But they have in common, of course, this dedication to international organization and norms. I mean, FDR presided over the birth of the United Nations. This was one of his great final projects. And Obama and his advisors are big believers in all that. I'm not sure that that answer explains every bit of Obama's foreign policy, because I think the rest of it is really political calculation on his part. But I do think he has, as a citizen of the world, he has some obligations to the world. And he's prepared to use American military force up to a point to enforce those obligations. Any other questions? Yes.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, so this will be our last question.
That's good, because I'm out of answers.
I appreciate your description of liberalism or progressivism as viewing history as something that should not be paid any real attention to, except it seems that it puts Obama and others in a natural dilemma, which is they say they should pay no attention to history except their own history of progressivism. And why would not a truly pragmatic position be that, well, maybe it's time to try something different, which could include conservatism?
Yes, this is the problem of progress. It could turn into regress if the old truths come around again. But it's not quite the case that they are not interested in history. It's just that they're, in their understanding, the wisdom of the past cannot be authoritative for our situation, because our situation is fundamentally different and better than it was in the past. And so if you think about the slogan, which Woodrow Wilson's charge to try to make the sons as little unlike their fathers as possible naturally leads to, namely, trust no one over 30. I mean, that's really the effective teaching of Wilson on that matter, because it's the young who know, because they are more in touch with the processes of life, with history, with what's coming next. If you take that seriously, it means the abolition of wisdom. And thus of all sources of wisdom from anyone over 30. I mean, not many people would ask for a surgeon who's under 30. You know, could you give me the least experienced man that you have in the operating room? But that is, in effect, what liberalism prescribes for us politically. Well, thank you very much.